Chris was a college student working part-time at a pizza shop to make ends meet. His shifts often stretched late into the night, but he didn't mind. It helped pay the bills. One night, around 1 a.m., as Chris was wrapping up his shift, the shop's phone rang. He hesitated for a moment before answering. The shop was officially closed, but he picked up anyway. "Hello?" Chris said. The voice on the other end was low and unsettling. A man spoke slowly, ordering 4 large pizzas. Chris was tempted to decline, but the thought of a good tip made him reconsider. "All right," he said. "It'll be there in about 30 minutes." The address was on the outskirts of town, in a secluded area. Chris packed up the pizzas and hopped on his bike, hoping to get the job done quickly. The roads grew darker as he rode farther from the city. Streetlights disappeared, replaced by dense trees on both sides. The silence was oppressive, and the occasional rustling in the bushes made him uneasy. After what felt like an eternity, Chris arrived at the address. It was an old, decrepit house, surrounded by overgrown weeds. The windows were broken, and the paint had peeled off the walls. The place looked abandoned. Chris stopped in front of the gate, staring at the house. "This can't be right," he muttered. He double-checked the address on his phone. It matched perfectly. He decided to call the number that had placed the order, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and uneasy, Chris thought about leaving, but the thought of his manager yelling at him for wasting 4 pizzas kept him there. Summoning his courage, Chris opened the creaky gate and walked up to the front door. The place was eerily quiet, with no lights on inside. He rang the doorbell and called out, "Pizza delivery." No response. He rang again, louder this time. Still nothing. Chris turned to leave when the porch light flickered on. Startled, he spun back to face the door. It creaked open slightly, though no one was there. A chill ran down his spine. "Hello?" Chris called, his voice trembling. "Is anyone home?" No answer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. A dim light flickered in the hallway, barely illuminating the space. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The air was thick and stale, making it hard to breathe. "Your pizzas are here," Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. A soft sound broke the silence, a faint giggle, like that of a child. Chris froze. He looked around, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" he called again, more urgently. The giggle grew louder, echoing through the house. It seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hall. Against his better judgment, Chris walked toward it. As he reached the door, it swung open on its own. Inside, 2 young girls sat on the floor, their heads bowed. "Hey, are your parents here? I need to deliver this pizza," Chris said, forcing a smile. The girls didn't respond. Slowly, they lifted their heads to look at him. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were pitch black. Chris took a step back, nearly dropping the pizzas. What's going on?" The girls smiled, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. They pointed toward a corner of the room. Chris turned his head and felt his heart stop. A woman stood there, shrouded in shadow. Her long, tangled hair covered most of her face, but her glowing red eyes were unmistakable. Her hands were twisted and claw-like, reaching out toward him. The pizzas fell from Chris's hands as he stumbled backward. The woman moved closer, her bare feet making no sound against the floor. Chris turned and bolted out of the house, his heart pounding like a drum. As he reached his bike, he glanced back. The woman and the 2 girls stood in the doorway, watching him with blank expressions. Their eyes followed him as he sped away. Chris thought he was safe, but a strange feeling crept over him. His bike began to wobble, and the engine sputtered before dying completely. He got off to inspect it, and realized the tires were slashed. He fumbled for his phone to call for help. As he dialed, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Looking into his bike's mirror, he saw the reflection of the woman and the girl standing just behind him. Chris spun around, but there was nothing there. His hands trembled as he dialed the police. "Please send someone now," he begged. He abandoned his bike and ran into the woods, hoping to lose whatever was following him. The branches scratched at his arms, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, he crouched behind a tree, trying to calm down. The silence was suffocating. Then he heard it, a soft giggle, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching leaves. The giggling grew louder, circling him. Chris bolted, running blindly through the forest. A faint siren reached his ears, and he sprinted toward the sound. When he emerged from the trees, he saw the flashing lights of a police car. Relief washed over him as he stumbled toward the officers. He explained everything, his voice shaking. The police agreed to check the house. Chris waited outside while they investigated. After a few minutes, they returned, shaking their heads. "There's no one there," one officer said. "The place is completely empty." Chris insisted they were wrong, but the officers led him back to his bike. Strangely, the tires were intact, and the engine started without a problem. The next morning, Chris did some digging and learned the chilling truth. 3 years ago, a woman and her 2 daughters had lived in that house. One night, all 3 were brutally murdered. The case was never solved, but locals believed their spirits still haunted the property. Chris quit his job that day and never delivered pizzas again. But he could never shake the memory of that night, or the question that haunted him most: who placed that order? Daniel was a college student, juggling studies and a part-time job as a pizza delivery driver. He worked at a small pizza shop in town, a place known for its late-night orders. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped pay the bills. One Friday night, close to midnight, Daniel was wrapping up his shift. The shop was quiet, and he was ready to head home. Just as he started wiping down the counters, the phone rang. He stared at it for a moment. It was late, and they were technically closed. Sighing, Daniel picked up the receiver. "Pizza Den, this is Daniel. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was raspy, almost a whisper. 4 large pepperoni pizzas. Delivery to 9 Willow Lane. Daniel hesitated. He knew that address was on the outskirts of town, far from the shop. We're actually closed for the night," he said. "Please," the voice interrupted. "I'll pay double." The promise of extra cash made Daniel pause. He needed the money, and double the price meant a generous tip. "All right," he said reluctantly. "Your order will be there in 30 minutes. He quickly prepared the pizzas, packed them in the delivery bag, and hopped onto his scooter. The streets were mostly empty, and the cold night air nipped at his face as he rode. The route to 9 Willow Lane took him away from the city lights and into a rural area. The road became narrow and uneven, flanked by tall trees on either side. There were no street lights, just the dim beam of his scooter cutting through the darkness. After what felt like forever, Daniel reached the address. The house was old and isolated, sitting at the edge of the forest. Its wooden exterior was weathered, with ivy creeping up the walls. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly. Daniel parked his scooter and stared at the house. Something about it felt off. He shivered, blaming it on the cold. Grabbing the pizzas, he approached the front door. He rang the doorbell and waited. The sound echoed faintly inside, but no one answered. "Pizza delivery," he called out, but still there was silence. As he turned to leave, The porch light flickered off, plunging him into darkness. Startled, Daniel fumbled for his phone to use as a flashlight. That's when he noticed something, a faint light glowing from one of the upstairs windows. Taking a deep breath, he decided to knock on the door one more time. Just as his knuckles touched the wood, the door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" Daniel called, peering inside. The hallway was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture. The air smelled damp and stale. He stepped inside cautiously. "I'm here with your pizzas. Is anyone home?" A soft rustling noise came from the living room. Hoping it was the customer, Daniel walked toward the sound. The room was empty, but a rocking chair in the corner was swaying gently, as if someone had just been sitting in it. "All right, this isn't funny," Daniel muttered, his voice shaky. Suddenly he heard a faint giggle behind him. He spun around, but saw nothing. The giggle came again, this time from upstairs. Daniel's heart raced. He wanted to leave, but the thought of his boss docking his pay kept him rooted. Clutching the pizza bag like a shield, he climbed the creaky staircase. The light from the upstairs room spilled into the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and Daniel could hear faint whispers inside. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, two small girls sat on the floor, playing with what looked like old dolls. Their backs were to him, their long hair hiding their faces. Hey," Daniel said nervously. "I have your pizzas. Are your parents here?" The girls didn't respond. Daniel took a step closer. "Listen, it's late, and I need to—" The girls turned to face him, and Daniel froze. Their eyes were pitch black, their faces unnaturally pale. They smiled in unison, revealing sharp teeth. Daniel stumbled backward, dropping the pizzas. What the hell?" The girls pointed toward the corner of the room. Slowly, Daniel turned his head. A woman stood there, her figure shrouded in shadow. Her hair was long and wild, covering most of her face. Her hands were unnaturally elongated, with sharp nails that scraped against the wall as she moved closer. Daniel bolted out of the room, nearly tripping over his own feet. He raced down the stairs, but the front door wouldn't budge. Behind him, he could hear the sound of footsteps and faint laughter. Desperate, he ran into the kitchen, looking for another way out. The back door was locked, but through the window he could see his scooter parked outside. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. Daniel turned around and saw the woman standing in the doorway. Her head tilted unnaturally, and her red eyes glowed in the darkness. "Stay away," Daniel shouted, grabbing a chair to defend himself. The woman let out a deafening scream that shook the room. The lights flickered wildly, and Daniel used the distraction to smash the window with the chair. He climbed out, cutting his arm on the broken glass, and sprinted to his scooter. He started the engine and sped down the road, not daring to look back. As he rode, he noticed the air around him growing colder. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their shadows twisting into unnatural shapes. Suddenly, his scooter sputtered and came to a stop. No, Daniel groaned, trying to restart it. Then he heard it, the soft giggle of the girls, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. Terrified, Daniel looked in his mirror. The woman and the two girls were standing in the middle of the road, their heads tilted as they stared at him. Daniel abandoned the scooter and ran into the forest. The branches clawed at his clothes as he stumbled through the undergrowth. He tripped over a root and fell, landing hard on the ground. He stayed there, holding his breath, listening. The forest was eerily silent. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The woman was there, her glowing eyes fixed on him. A blaring police siren broke the silence. The woman hissed and vanished into the shadows. Daniel scrambled to his feet and ran back to the road, where a police car had pulled up. The officers listened as he told them what happened, though they didn't seem to believe him. When they went to the house, it was empty, except for a stray black cat that darted out the door. The next morning, Daniel learned the truth. 3 years ago, a woman and her 2 daughters had lived in that house. They were found dead under mysterious circumstances, and the house had been abandoned ever since. Daniel quit his job that day. But even now he can't forget the haunting faces of the woman and her daughters. Sometimes, when he's alone at night, he hears faint giggles, as if they're still watching him.